Now, Ken, I only have like 3 things written down here. You went to Tulane University for your undergrad, and then you completed your PhD at Colorado State. And then I just have SHL written down here, and that's about it.
SHL. Yeah, I had about 10 different names along the way. But yeah, that's the basic story. I have this was my first MPA meeting in about 10 years. So I think my last, I don't think I was a dues payer. I think I was one of those absconders who just paid like the $10 at the door or whatever. But my last meeting was when I left Minneapolis in probably in early 2011. So 10 years. And then it's 12 years to the day tomorrow from the last time I talked at MPA. So in 2009, I presented to MPA on competencies and was really kind of looking at the intersection between human traits and characteristics and jobs and what's the language in the middle. And that was before SHL. So back then it was called Provisor. So yeah, I've been doing a lot of PhD IO, started off doing traditional consulting and delivery. And then actually moved into sales and business development and account management and working on kind of program management with large employers who were using online assessments. Then I moved into the product side, and I've spent the kind of back half or almost 2/3 of my career now really on the product and research and development side. Along the way, SHL was a lot of different things. When I joined, it was about a 40-person business, and Michael Hepperlin here was one of my colleagues and mentors. And then by the time I left the business in 2015, it was a 4,000-person kind of global publicly traded monster that we know as CEB back then. And then CEB turned into Gartner. I actually did a startup in our space. So I did an assessment technology startup called Psychobabble. Gartner spun off SHL because SHL is an assessment business and Gartner is some other thing that's completely not psychology and not assessment. So they very wisely spun off SHL. And about 6 months after SHL regained their independence, I rejoined SHL now as the Chief Science and Innovation Officer. It's really interesting because it's been very much a transformation of a company that had been kind of misunderstood underneath a corporate umbrella. So getting to be a full-fledged, badge-wearing assessment company again, which is pretty neat. And that's what really brings me here today to talk about some innovation and assessment and the 3 big keywords you need to know to sound clever at an assessment technology cocktail party. So let me see if I can share my screen. Populate my presentation. Do you guys see it full screen? Yeah.
Yep. Yes.
Good to go. All right. So yeah, I've got a lot of slides and I don't need to go through them all. So you might hear me kind of rush through something. If anybody has something that you're interested in though, and you want to talk about at the time, go ahead and just do a shout out. I probably won't try to track the chat until the end. So you can write your questions in there, but then I won't really see them to the end because I'm going to be trying to think about what I'm saying. But if you actually say something, I'd gladly listen to what it is, and we can spend some time if you want to on that specific issue. There's really kind of 3 areas we're going to cover, and we can go deeper in any one of those. I want to talk a bit about cognitive ability testing. I'm going to talk a bit about, call it personality testing, personality and behavioral testing. And then I'm going to talk a bit about artificial intelligence specifically. Arguably, AI has been with us for a long time, depending on what you call machine learning, things like theory and computer adaptive testing are AI systems as well. But we're going to talk about the next level and what people today are usually meaning when they say AI, which is more of the natural language processing. So it's really about, that's what we're going to cover. I know not everyone here is deep into assessment. So it has enough depth here that if you are an assessment person, hopefully you'll get something out of it. But I think also it's got enough bright colors and interesting concepts that if you're not deep into assessment, you'll find it informative as well. first off, of the three kind of things, you'll see me weave these through all of these. So those are the meta trends that are being imposed on psychology. Mobile computing. It's no longer the internet. That's what we solved for about 20 years. Now we're solving mobile. There's an overlap there. UX is a practice that kind of originated in computer science and computer system design. And it's now being imposed as a buying criteria by employers who are looking for assessment programs. But that's because of this innovation and the move to mobile and apps and just getting much better, more clever, simple technology to use. That's people's expectation now. And then AI is this third big kind of enabling technology that's now widely available, both for use and misuse. And so that's why those are the three kind of pressures on technology, on assessment technology. And so this talk's going to describe how we're responding as a field and some of the research we've done and where we think the gaps are and where we think the gains are. So that's the point. First off, though, why is mobile so important? And are we really still talking about this? It turns out we are really still talking about this. The reason it's important and what you're going to see in one of my take-home messages will be mobile ready is not the same as mobile first. And in fact, it's a completely different world. And converting the old stuff we've done to be able to work on a mobile phone is a lot less exciting and a lot less effective than actually redesigning for the phone as the starting delivery unit. I'll show you what I mean by that. But why is the phone so important? 81% of Americans own a smartphone, only 75% own a computer. 17% of Americans, and this is from 2019, so this could have shifted. This is the latest Pew data that I was able to find on this. 70% of Americans are smartphone dependent, which is that's their only access to the internet at home. 22% of young people are smartphone dependent, so you're more likely to be smartphone dependent if you're younger. And that means that that's almost a quarter of people under 30, working adults, who can't apply for a job or take an assessment unless it works on a mobile device. And it has to work as well on a mobile device as it does somewhere else, otherwise they're at a disadvantage. So reliance on smartphones for online access, especially common against younger, non-white, and lower income Americans. Why does this all matter? Well, it matters because a lot of assessment is used in recruiting, and we're already worried about adverse impact. Here's a potential that if we're not careful and we're not serving up mobile in the right way, or even at all, that we may actually be exacerbating adverse impact through sourcing and differential access even to job application and assessment process. So mobile has to be front and center for any assessment designer, unless you're designing purely internal assessments for people who you're controlling the test taking environment and you really have it buttoned down. Outside of that, you really have to start from the phone as the dominant method that people use the computer here in 2021. Depending on the audience, that's like, duh, that's obvious, Ken. And some people will just shake their head and say that can't possibly be. I still use my desktop computer all the time. You know, I'm just giving you the facts here. So mobile's
can't put a long paragraph in there anymore and ask about reading comprehension.
Mobile is modal now. This is the way that people access computers, and therefore anything that you design that's for computer administered and computer delivered, you have to be thinking of mobile first design. What do candidates want? So if we're thinking, and I'll talk a little bit about talent mobility and talent management too, but if we think primarily about recruiting as the more difficult use case for assessment because of legal fairness and all kinds of other reasons, candidates want a chance to show what they can do. They, a chance to, they want to feel like they had that you really got a sense of what they can do. They want to believe through their experience of the content or the assessment process that it's job related, which we call usually face validity. If it's mobile, they want it to be engaging. For everything that's not engaging and that's not important, it should be fast and frictionless. So all the boring stuff like registration. Why can't I register just by clicking access my LinkedIn account? Or why can't I register with my Facebook? All that stuff is kind of what we call table stakes at this point for most online systems involved in any kind of enterprise software. And candidates want feedback. So I know that we've always been skittish as American psychologists sharing feedback in employment decisions, especially about the assessment, but it's coming and it's here for a lot of employers already. And it's kind of a big deal if you're a humanist and you believe in the value of people and their time to give something back after you've extracted so much with our assessments. So that's what people want. How do we know that's what people want? We've surveyed people, we've talked to people. I'm not going to go through this. This is a study of about 11,000 people. It's a very good study. It's a few years old. Very likely these trends have moved even more towards mobile accessibility. Oh, and just pointing out that 58%, the majority now of people coming out of college who are going into their early career professions would prefer to apply and take an assessment on a mobile device. It's just for convenience. So what's the problem? The problem is how we've been approaching our testing has been to simply carry over the inventions of previous generations of psychologists. Rather than building upon them, we've simply ported. So when you take something like a cognitive ability test, which fundamentally literally hasn't changed in format since 1917 when it was first invented, when you put that on a mobile device, it turns out it doesn't work. And this is new. So we've had great success moving things from paper to computer. And by and large, with the exception of reading speed, we've found equivalence almost everywhere we've looked with minor differences in norms and things. So the shift from paper to computer to digital hasn't been that difficult. This is what happens when you put a multiple choice cognitive ability tests on mobile devices. What you're seeing here are the standardized mean difference in scores across a number of studies. This was from a 2017 paper that pulled together all the research up until that time on mobile administration of assessments. And these are the score differences to the disadvantage of the mobile test takers across these different independent studies. The ones that are kind of in the 1/3 to half of a standard deviation, those represent tablets. The ones that are on the almost a full standard deviation represent phones. So if you take a traditional World War I style multiple choice cognitive ability test on a phone, you're losing about a standard deviation of score.
Ken, I got a quick question for you.
Yeah, lay it on me, Roger.
Were the tablets, anecdotally, do you know if they were mostly entirely touch-based, or was there any type of keyboard module or anything like that?
I don't know, but I would just, because this is a mix, so this was a roundup of 23 studies. I suspect that the tablet studies were touch, but I don't know exactly. It's going to be interesting though, because what you'll see is what we did with touch is we actually took it to our advantage. So anything where that would have been a disadvantage, like versus how people are used to operating a test, you kind of, by flipping the lens and starting from the phone, we actually were able to use touch quite powerfully. And I'll show you guys that in a second. So this is the research up until basically 2019. The team at SHL was working on this issue for a long time. So I left the business in 2015, and we had already been working for a couple of years trying to solve what we called mobile cognitive and the problem of these device differences. And we actually hadn't solved it when I left. And so we didn't offer our cognitive ability tests on a mobile device. SHL is a little strange that way. We often will take the higher ground when it comes to kind of ethical or validity issues. And so we actually would message candidates like, you can't continue the test. You have to go find a desktop. Eventually that became ridiculous, as you would imagine, because I just showed you most people would prefer to take it on a phone. So we were kind of tasked with, you have to solve this. And we found people were making progress. We were able to stand on the shoulders of giants. There was some really good work done by Arthur Doverspike and others on this thing called the structural characteristic information processing model, which gave us a way to start to think about how to design through the lens of a mobile first device and still elicit the kind of construct behaviors we were looking for in terms of problem solving in the broad ability area of numerical reasoning, deductive reasoning, and inductive reasoning, and mechanical and some others that we've released since. And do that in a way that we didn't expect there. We were designing to try to avoid device differences that were plaguing the current version of multiple choice tests. It required some other things though. So we've been using computer adaptive testing and item banks and item response theory for quite a long time because we have a global business and test security, and there's all kinds of good reasons to do IRT and CAT. And for our cognitive tests, we've always used CAT. These tests use CAT as well. But we actually, what you see on screen is what these, I'll go to the full screen kind of demo. This is not going to look great because it's a GIF playing through Zoom, but you'll get a little sense and it should just repeat. So these are just 4 sample items you can kind of see. The first thing you'll notice is there's no response options. There's no A, B, C, D, E, or anything like that. This is a task that the respondent is given to solve, a problem-solving task involving numerical reasoning, deductive reasoning, or inductive reasoning, pattern recognition. And the way that they solve the problems is by interacting with the screen. In this case, it's a pie chart problem where they're being asked to kind of replicate percentages that are given to them in tabular form into graphical form, and they can actually do that by dragging the graph. This one is a deductive logic type one. You know, Michael cannot sit next to Joe, who can only sit next to Anna, who's not allowed to sit next to Dick. How does the table get set? And you're dragging and dropping badges. This is a calendaring one where you're trying to arrange the schedule and fit things together. The overall test is slightly speeded. It does have a time limit, although we usually see people do complete many of the items, especially motivated applicants. So how do you do that? How do you have a test like this that could be automatically scored? And I'm sure if Nathan Thompson on here, he would give you more detail. Basically, there's something called the Generalized partial credit model, which is another item response theory model that allows you to deconstruct a task like this instead of into a binary, yes, you got the right answer out of 5 or 4 multiple choices, and no, you didn't. Instead of a 1-0, you can actually assign partial credit throughout based on the pieces of the task that they do solve correctly. So you can actually earn partial credit on these items as you're working your way through the response. We can come back to this if you guys have interest. There's a variety of item types within each of those tasks. The interesting thing is, so we went through this design process. Obviously, we're doing a ton of user testing as we went through it and trialing. At the end of the day, we knew we were very comfortable with where we were headed. We got really good construct equivalence results. So that's what you're seeing here. So these are like for like measures with the traditional multiple choice format of our established instruments, measuring the exact same broad ability or general cognitive ability. Oh no, sorry, these are all the broad ability measures. And the parallel verify interactive, which is the version I just showed you. So really good construct equivalence. These are uncorrected. And D+, I won't go into that too much other than to say we do have a version of the test that lumps everything together. And because you do that and because they're related, you actually don't need as many test questions and you can get as many scores. So G+ is our way of measuring general cognitive ability and the 3 broad abilities all in a tighter package. The cool thing is, here's the punchline. The cool thing is, every other study has shown that it takes longer to do cognitive ability test items on a mobile device. What we found is that it did not take longer to do these types of items on a mobile device than it did to do on a desktop, laptop computer with a mouse. So we found from a time completion, contrary to all published research, ours had equivalent time. And then the big payoff here is we found effectively nil differences between device types in terms of the completion of these items. So people were neither slower nor were they score disadvantaged by going through these types of cognitive ability measures that were designed using a particular model of how the brain works, how screen formatting works, how to arrange that. So like putting some effort into what we call the UX, or the user experience design, and the UI, working as a cross-functional team with psychometricians, mobile developers, and UX designers, doing iterative user testing. So that methodology worked, and it produced an assessment now that we believe is mobile equivalent. So we now, with confidence, recommend to our customers that they can use these assessments with candidates coming in through any of the recruiting channels that they might have. These results were published in peer-reviewed research in the Personnel Assessment Decisions, I think it's called, the PAD journal that Scott Highhouse and is run out of Bowling Green. So there's a 2019 publication that sums up this research program and our achievement of what we believe to be the world's first mobile equivalent cognitive ability test, which is pretty cool. So more fair, more accessible, more people get to take it, especially more poor, young, and minority people who otherwise wouldn't be able to apply for some of these jobs. So that's about 1/3 of the story. I got 2 more little stories to tell you. Again, stop me if you want to go deeper on any of this. The next story is kind of, how is this stuff playing out in the area of preference-based assessment, or what you might think of as personality and behavioral, attitudinal measures, et cetera. This is not surveys though, this is assessment, predictive assessment. So talk a little bit about the OPQ. What we now is the OPQ 32R. That's a specific edition of the OPQ. Originally released in 1984. Just to give you the brief background on the OPQ, it's been around forever. It has been generationed and iterated, and I'll talk about the latest one and what we did to it in a good way, what we did to it about 1.5 years ago. It measures 32 personality dimensions. That's the 32. It's really clever in terms of scoring and response, and that's kind of part of the secret ingredient to the story, and I'll weave that in. But it uses something called multidimensional force choice. That's easy. That just means you're going to see 3 statements on screen. You have to pick one that's most like you, and those statements are going to be from different constructs, and they're going to be bound to social desirability. So it puts you in a predicament as a respondent. You really have to try to respond honestly, because it's not really clear how you would gain an advantage by responding dishonestly. So that's the benefit of force choice and multidimensional force choice. The Thurstonian Irt Scoring is an invention that happened in 2009 that finally liberated force choice from ipsative. So especially for those of us who got our PhDs earlier than others on the call, many of us remember that if you asked someone to rank order things, or to say, I'm more this than that, historically, that resulted in purely ipsative measurement, where you could only then say something about that person relative to that person. So you could rank order your strengths, and I could say, well, for you, that's a strength. But you didn't have actually any information about how that compared to other people. In 2009, using item response theory, and actually some old ideas from Thurstone, it's called Thurstonian IRT, we were able to recover normative information from forced choice or rank ordered response data. So it's super cool. And what it did basically is it means now suddenly all this stuff that previously was only ever used for like employee development, because you couldn't give someone a norm or percentile or any kind of scoring for comparison, now you can. So these tools that have this powerful kind of anti-faking technology, which is the multidimensional force choice, now actually also have norms and all of the other things. So it brought the world together. So it's very cool. It's used everywhere in our business. It's used everywhere. It actually is used kind of everywhere around the world too. 61 countries, about 2,500 companies, roughly 2 million participants a year go through it, employees and applicants. And we can do a lot of stuff with those 32 scores. We can composite them up into all kinds of different insights and inferences. We revalidated it recently. It's available in all kinds of languages, 37 languages. And it's been used for so long that we've got millions and millions of data points on it. So that's all cool. The challenge was we were tasked with redesigning it because we had done the bad thing. We had taken old science and just put it on a mobile device. We didn't reimagine how it should have been built if we had started today, if the founders of the OPQ had started today with the kind of computing power and interface we had, they wouldn't have had 3 circle bubbles that you fill out with a paper and pencil that then became 3 circle bubbles that you fill out with a mouse that then became 3 circle bubbles that you fill out with your finger. That you wouldn't have done that. That's just how it happened. And it happened not just to SHL, but of course to everyone. So the encouragement here is to really rethink this. And that's the opportunity we had in summer of 2019. But because it's so massively used, there's a lot of pressure on my team not to break it. So yeah, we want you to make it look better, but please don't break it. It's used too many places. We have too many reports, too many norms, too many customers, too many programs. And of course, there's ways to change things without forcing everyone to take it, but we really wanted to make it good enough that everyone would get to experience the upgrade. So the object was to improve the experience of it, to get it to a more modern design so it looks good on a phone. Why do you care if it looks good on a phone? We care because our buyers care, and employers care because people expect it. And if your application process, part of it, looks like garbage because of the vendor you're using, then you look like garbage. It's just how it goes. It's Pavlov. It's guilt by association. So if your assessment is old looking, they associate that you're some kind of an old-fashioned employer. Why else would you be using these really obviously old looking tools? So that's the kind of pressure we're getting to upgrade it. So we want it to look better. We had a hypothesis. I had a hypothesis we could make it move faster if we could kind of get out of the way of the person. Now you guys know with personality, the goal is to try to get people not to overthink it, both for faking and for accuracy and reliability. It just works better if people are kind of almost the faster they can respond, the better. So we're trying to get to that. Here's a preview, and I'll show you a little animation of how we did this too. So you can see that on the left is the old. So I don't know if you can see my cursor, probably not. On the left, you can see the instructions, just long, like a lot of instructions. And that's because it came out of a test booklet that was then built online, that was then carried over to the phone version. It wasn't terrible, each individual decision, but collectively, when you look backwards on it, you're like, wow, that's an unusual task to give someone on a mobile device, I guess is the best way to put it. And then if you look at the question format, it was like this question, and it was really trying to get you to say, it's most like me or least like me. So making some type of a judgment. Swiping was enabled because that was like, oh, a phone, people like to swipe. But it wasn't very intuitive. It didn't work very well for me. And it was fine. It was mobile ready. And if you buy mobile ready, that's what you're going to get. Something old that people put on a phone. The right-hand side is mobile first. So reimagining how you present instructions to people. We've done some really clever things in here. We basically only give them what they need to know and at the time. So literally get down to like a simple page of instructions. We're going to show you some statements. Click on the statement that's like you. Like it doesn't need to be pages and pages of kind of jargon, and it's so off-putting to get that much instruction. So anyway, streamline the instructions and a fundamental reimagination of the response process. So let me show you that. This is what the flow would look like in 4 sequences. So this is like a comic book version of it. On the first screen, when you presented with an item on the OPQ, you get 3 statements. And you're asked to say which statement describes you the most, and you touch it. When you touch it, it disappears. The other statements collapse, and there's only 2 statements now remaining. And your task, as opposed to what it used to be, which was to pick one that's the most like me and pick one that's the least like me, we let you stay with most. So you're constantly making only the kind of favorability judgments. You're basically able to get someone in a flow because they're not having to cognitively task switch between a most like me and a least like me comparison. This is 104 triplets, this test. So we were actually asking people to switch tasks 104 times during the assessment. Each item, we were asking people to create a model of which of these statements is most like them, and then to then reject that entirely and to start anew and to think about which of the statements was least like them. That's completely artificial and was related to what was the best layout on a paper and pencil answer key. That's the only reason that exists. What the scoring model requires is the rank ordering of those three statements. So the Thurstonian IRT, what it needs to be able to generate scores for people from items is to know high, medium, and low. Just tell me what order they're in. How you get there, that's for you UX designers to figure out. And what we found is that moving to this model, not having people switch between a most and a least comparison, we actually were able to reduce test administration time for the exact same test with the exact same number of items by 40% on average. That's incredible. That shows the cognitive burden we were putting on people to make 104, 208 really different judgments about themselves compared to words on screen. And by keeping it in the constant most like me, all you have to do is say, which of these do I like the best? There's the fundamental approach and avoidance. We were asking people to do both an approach and an avoidance task over and over. Now it's purely an approach task. Which of these is most like me? Most like me. It becomes a much easier judgment for people. And we didn't break it. So I'll show you that in a second. You can just see here what it looks like though, how it plays out. There's no next button. So we made it all auto advance. You can go back, so you can make a correction if you had a fat finger error, but generally speaking, with the layout here with the large tiles, people don't use the back button. They don't have a lot of fat finger errors. By also not encouraging people to kind of look back and review responses, we're getting rid of some of that overthinking and faking and impression management. So you've seen what it looks like. It's running on screen. Let me show you the kind of results. Basically, what we found is we didn't break it. And so we were able to release it at the end of this study to all customers. So now the entire world is spending 40% less time taking the OPQ than they were before. And that's across millions of people a year, which is kind of cool. Construct equivalence, we use structural equation modeling to model this out because it's very complicated multidimensional item response theory data. There were very small, basically negligible mean differences across administration formats. Reliabilities were extremely similar and had the same kind of dips and valleys across the pattern of the 32 scales, regardless of reimagined and mobile first design versus the traditional design. And the test retest showed that looks like the old OPQ used to look. It's performing just as well. There's a lot more detail under the hood in terms of item response theory and item parameter estimates and other ways that we looked at this. But the very reassuring short version is that the tests are equivalent. These are equivalent forms, which does make sense. It's the same items, but for me, this was really kind of magical to see, like, when you give yourself permission to, we called it OPQ reimagined. And so I'm trying not to say that because I'm sick of it. But when you really give yourself permission to reimagine something as fundamental as how am I even answering this question? And why am I answering it that way? Is it because that's what the Army recruits on the floor needed to do with their pencils and their paper? Or is this the right way to approach this now that we have mobile phones? So very much a success story, and now it's the upgraded product, and nobody has the old format. So it's been now implemented in 100% of the usage of the OPQ, which is great. The last bit is on AI, and this is kind of, and some of this is, there's other resources if folks want to go deeper on any of this, I can point you to as well. This is a little bit of a retread of a webinar we did. Pulled out some stuff to make it a bit more relevant for this, but With AI, we've got to worry about two things, actually. And maybe we always have to worry about it, but because the rest of our assessment tools and technologies are so time-tested, we don't worry as much about some of it. But here it's really brand new. And we really do have to worry about ethics and fairness and issues of how we treat people, as well as, is this stuff even working? And how do you know it's working? And it's scary because it seems like something that everybody knows more about than you do, right? It's like, oh shoot, we've been talking about AI for 5 years now. Everybody obviously is a machine learning expert and guru, and every employer except for us apparently is using it. And I wonder if all that's true. We'll try to debunk some of that. Why should you care about what I think about this or the team at SHL? Just pointing out, it's humble bragging here. The SHL has been a part of a lot of the standard setting globally, including the ITC guidelines. Our staff edited and edited that. The unproctored internet testing best practices, publications, the principles. There was an SHL staff member, one of the lead writers in the latest principles. We're the first kind of peer-reviewed mobile equivalent ability assessments. And now we've published a paper here on ethical and effective use of AI. The point here is just that we're trying to encourage good practice, and we're freely sharing our findings and what we're finding is working with the field in the hope that all practice can rise. And just because we have the luxury of being in the position to work on this stuff, we're very happy to share the innovation. First off, why should we care about AI? So this is the fact or hype slide. The message behind all of these is it's transformational, it's everywhere, it's reinventing, it's expanding, it's taking over HR. Is it? Here's some research we did. This was last year, so this is pretty recent. 3% of employers are using AI in assessment. 3% are haters and say they'll never use it. Everybody else is in the middle, kind of looking at it, thinking about it, exploring it, trying to learn about it, figuring out what they're going to do. So if you're not currently implementing an AI assessment, you're in the vast majority right now. Nevertheless, it is getting some press and some headlines, and including some pretty bad headlines. So why bother? What's the promise here? What's the hope? The hope is that it'll do a bunch of things for us, and it might solve some of those things, such as you heard of the validity diversity dilemma, which is just a horrible, white journal editor name for a really sensitive issue. But we're hoping that AI is going to help us with some of this stuff. We think AI assessments could help enhance validity by either scoring new types of information that you can't easily score right now. It may help reduce bias and help us solve adverse impact. It may allow us to have assessments where people can naturally respond, which is good for reactions and possibly for validity and fairness. It allows us to have higher fidelity assessments at scale. So things like open-ended assessment center simulation exercises that could be scored with artificial intelligence. And an overall better candidate experience. These are all potential things that AI could enable, mostly because it allows us to deal with more complex information as opposed to shunting everyone into A, B, C, D, or some kind of a forced choice. Well, how do you evaluate it though? And what are we even talking about? We're going to do the simple version of this and the fast version. Apologies to anyone who's spending a lot of time in this area. You'll know there's a lot of nuance between some of these terms, but it's also a bit of a ado about nothing. Generally speaking, AI is the catch-all. It's a little different from statistics, and it's a little different from computer science, but it's all those things that you would think it is. Machine learning is a subset of AI. Natural language processing is a subset of AI that is mostly machine learning based. Deep learning and cognitive computing are kind of newer modeling techniques that allow you to go through multiple layers of data and to develop features in very iterative and dynamic ways, develop predictors and models. So they're all considered AI. We've got a definition to get us out of jail today, which is AI assessment means it's a non-human who's analyzing your responses using some version of machine learning, natural language processing, or other algorithmic modeling, assigning scores to people or to predicted outcomes like a probability of retention. And it's not a specific method. So I'm not specifically talking about video interviews here or any other method. The assessment, AI scoring kicks in after you've collected responses. So this could be applied to any type of response data, and everything I'm about to say still applies. I don't know why that was in there twice. There's some risks. So those are the potential benefits. What are the risks? Largely, they're in these three buckets: legal, reputational, and validity. Legal, there's some data privacy laws. There's even data privacy laws related to AI assessment now. And then in general, laws related to fair employment and adverse impact and discrimination. So all of those still apply, plus the data privacy stuff. Why is the data privacy stuff trickier here? Well, because you're often recording audio, you may be recording video and imagery, starting to get into a lot of different types of data besides just people's tick lists, responses to a multiple choice test. The reputational risk is probably the biggest one that I see right now. There's not a lot of lawsuits for AI assessment because there's not a lot of AI assessment. But there was an HBO documentary a week ago, and there was an FCC complaint made against HireVue about a year ago. And, so there is reputational risk, I think, with this stuff. And then there's the validity bit, which most of us care about. Like, where's the science behind this? The idea that data scientists have somehow swooped in and come up with better predictive models than IO psychologists who've been working on the problem area for 100 years, I'm skeptical. It doesn't seem to hold water yet. So you guys will have this. I'll send this as a PDF, so you'll have this. There's just a bunch of laws. We've compiled them. This is in our white paper too, which you got a link to. Again, you can download the white paper and you can opt out of the marketing and you don't have to pay anything. So if you're ever going to get asked about this at work, get the white paper. It's like 20 pages, but it specifically ties to things that you should all be comfortable with, such as the PSYOP principles and the APA ethics standards. So it makes those connections to these issues around AI in a bit more detail than 10 minutes I'm spending on it right now. There's 3 core principles though. So we got 3 principles and 6 standards. I'm going to spend more time on the principles, and then the standards I'm just going to brush over. The 3 principles are: AI assessment is still assessment. All the same rules apply. Reliability needs to be described. Validity needs to be described. The burden of proof lies on the claimant to demonstrate that people going through this thing they describe produces information at the end that's useful to somebody. That burden still lays on the person making the claim. And all of the standards that we have for evaluating multiple choice tests, they actually still apply. Sometimes the statistics are a little bit different, but less often than you might suspect. The second principle: big claims require big evidence. This is a rephrasing of what's often been called the Sagan principle or the Sagan criterion. This is the exact same criterion that every journal editor across all of the sciences applies. And that is, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. If you're showing up, whether it's physics, biology, or psychology, with some finding that flies in the face of everything else that everyone else has found, you're going to have to tell a longer story in a series of multiple studies and a whole mountain of evidence because science is cumulative and integrative, and we're trying to build an increasingly better and more accurate story and model of the world. And so you can't just torpedo that by showing up and claiming that you rediscovered cold fusion. If you did discover cold fusion, I'm sure it'll be replicated. Tell us how you did it, you know? So big claims require big evidence. And if something sounds crazy, you're right to think that it's crazy. There's some crazy claims being made out there, like truly absurd. And so if you hear something that to you is like, huh, that doesn't sound like anything I've ever heard, and I'm a psychologist, you're probably right. The third one is AI assessment should be explainable. And that means what it says. You know, this goes to a certain extent, and we have to be careful not to hold AI to a higher bar than we would hold, for example, a biodata questionnaire. I've never seen anyone publish the scoring key of their biodata questionnaire in their tech manual and explain item by item, feature by feature, how that is built up either. So there's some black box in everything we do. It would be impossible for even in 3 hours for me to explain to you how the OPQ is scored. It's just, it's a multi-week kind of training thing. So the idea, it's like, well, what does explainable mean? There's clearly some boundary conditions, and different types of users will require different depths of explanation. But that's what the litmus test is. Does a test user have enough information to fairly and effectively use this assessment? Does a test participant have enough information to actually give you their acknowledgement or their consent, depending on what the case may be? So those are the three principles. And if you hang with those, you really don't need to know much machine learning math to really be quite an effective evaluator of machine learning and artificial intelligence-based assessment. Just as a quick exercise, and then I'll kind of stop talking and see if you guys have any questions. If we think about applying these three core principles to something like video interview, so AI assessment is still assessment. You're going to have people go through and do what? You have to explain it. Okay, well, people are going to be presented with interview questions on screen. They're going to have a period to prepare their response, 30 seconds, and then they're going to start speaking. So we've attempted to somewhat replicate what an interview experience might be like in person. Okay, what's the reliability? Well, what do you mean by that? Well, that's for you. You as the test creator, you have to tell me that. So what's the reliability? Is it test retest reliability? Is it, how are you estimating reliability? What's the validity evidence for it? What does it predict? What does it claim to be measuring? What are the constructs? All of those are, there's no reason that you shouldn't be able to answer those questions for an AI video assessment. So all of the same questions you would always ask: how reliable, how valid, who developed it, how was it developed, what's the evidence, has it been validated on more than one organization? All of those things you'd still ask about a video interview that's scored with artificial intelligence. Big claims require big evidence. If someone shows up saying, we use facial action units to predict whatever, I think you'd want to know a lot more about that. And you'd want to see kind of in detail the series of studies that support that inference, that the way that somebody's lips sneer or don't sneer during an interview response is related to anything that happens on the job. I haven't seen it yet. So that's the current state of the state, is there is no peer-reviewed evidence that facial action units predict job performance. Some people claim that they have evidence, but there's no peer-reviewed evidence. There's no replication, therefore there's no science. And it's not science if there's no peer review. So right now, that's the burden of proof lies with people who would say that how you blink your eyes, how you furrow your brow, and how you sneer your lips is somehow related to on-the-job performance. There's no theoretical model that supports that. In fact, if you really want to know, actually, all of the iSync emotion detection stuff has pretty much been exploded as well. Basically, yes, you can get people to reliably code acted emotional expressions, but the correspondence between someone's internal emotional state and what's on their face is nearly random. That's what the latest research shows. So yes, everyone could accurately say, Ken, that's an angry face. But in a natural course of conversation, whether I happen to be showing an angry face actually doesn't correspond to whether I feel angry. So what is it a measure of? I don't know. That's your job as the storyteller who's trying to sell me this widget. You have to explain it to me. I don't have to explain it to you, data scientist, why this is bullshit. You have to unpack the bullshit and explain it to me. So the burden lies on the claimant. And it should be documented. And you need to see a lot of evidence here because there is no peer-reviewed literature to peg this stuff to. You know, I've seen people implement cognitive ability assessments with absolutely no local validation very confidently because Frank Schmidt and a lot of other people have done a lot of work to say it pretty much always predicts, at least reasonably well, everywhere we've ever looked at it. There's nothing like that for some of these new AI scoring techniques. There is no peer-reviewed body of work that they can hang their hat on. So lastly, it has to be explainable. Again, not only does the burden of linking those chains of inferences fall on them, but how do I explain this to my boss? How do I explain this to the hiring manager who's going to make a decision? What actually are we disqualifying this person because of? What did they do wrong? Or what did they do right? You know, that shouldn't be too hard to explain, and I don't think will require anyone to give away any proprietary algorithms. So just bringing it home, this is my last slide. I just wanted to leave this up there for you. We won't go through this in detail, and if we were doing the full-blown webinar, this would be about the back half hour of it. We'd just be walking through each one of these in exquisite detail. So this is just to give you a high level. We've basically broken it down into 6 steps that start all the way in the planning process, all the way into deployment, and how you design an assessment program that uses artificial intelligence and try to stay on the right side of both professional practice, science and validity, ethics, and the law. And we think if you follow these 6 steps, you're in pretty good shape. First one is around data requirements and thinking through this stuff. It's interesting when you get into privacy stuff, actually, there's a real trade-off between wanting to get more data and one of the best practices in data privacy, which is data minimization, which is only collecting the bare minimum data you really need to get the results. That doesn't mean fewer sample sizes necessarily, but it probably means fewer demographic data of the person, et cetera. So thinking through all those issues and how it plays out in the particular geographies that your program applies to. If you're going into Europe, you've got some different standards. If you're in California, you've got some higher standards. If your business does any employment in Illinois, you've got some higher end standards. So there's a bit of patchwork still of standards to adhere to, but you start thinking about that stuff up front before you've administered a single thing or trialed a thing or built any models. You want to be thinking about transparency from the very beginning. So transparency and disclosure and things like that. As you start to get data and develop models and harvest features, you want to be thinking about how am I going to describe features? Just refer to predictors. So a feature could be a facial action unit. You know, Ken moved his cheek up at 1 frame, or it could be a bundle of words. And there could be different higher order features where a feature could basically get to where more or less what we think of as a construct. So some natural language bundle of words. But that modeling, that development of features, you have to be thinking about as you're going through that process, how are you going to explain this to people? So you're thinking about transparency from the very beginning. It's not something that comes at the end. Similarly, designing for fairness. How are we going to demonstrate that our algorithms are fair? It's really interesting if you peel back even one layer on some of the claims that are out there about all of the benefits that these AI tools are bringing. It's really difficult to understand how they make that claim. And sometimes they make that claim based on qualitative information. For example, we had a diverse set of participants. Therefore, our AI won't be biased because we've got a really broad set of response data that presumably is representative of everyone in the population. Is it? I don't know. And you got to measure that stuff. You can't just assume it. So you got to kind of design, if you're building this and you're going to roll out a program, you got to be thinking about, when are we measuring demographic information? How are we going to statistically verify that our model, that our assessment has little to no adverse impact, or that we understand where the adverse impact is? Rigorously validate. Again, the burden of proof is on you. You're the one building something new in this case. As a practitioner, you're the one building something new that's going to use artificial intelligence in a way that there's no peer-reviewed literature for. So you're going to probably expect to do some pilot studies and some subsequent studies, and to think of this as a program of research over time. You want to figure out how humans participate both in the feature development process. So instead of, we included everything in our model that had a correlation of more than 0.05. Well, that's an algorithmic model development process. Where's the human oversight? What if gender was one of those predictors? Likewise, building human oversight into how the results get fed back and digested by users to actually generate business or employment decisions. And lastly, disclose intent. This is something that's only going to get more and more pervasive. Right now, it's a patchwork depending on the geographies that the employer is working in. Sometimes it's actually consent. That tends to be more the EU standard, and that has certain legal and procedural requirements associated with it. Sometimes it is notification and more of an acknowledgement, like, I understand that AI may be used to score my responses, and they have to acknowledge that. The law in Illinois gives people the right to opt out. So you have to not only tell them, but you have to have some other way of scoring them if they choose not to have AI score their interview responses. So very cool. I intentionally not mathematical here at the end, because I really just wanted to empower people. That's the purpose of this AI stuff, is to say, yeah, eventually you do need someone who knows the math and the computational science behind the machine learning models that you're going to be implementing and looking at. But as an assessment, or as a practicing psychologist, as an assessment professional, as someone with an advanced degree in psychology, you can actually go 80 to 90% of the way down that road and protect your employer or serve your client, depending on your role. So anyway, I'll stop there. Thank you very much for your rapt attention on this whirlwind tour of all the different technology moving parts. I hope you can see now why it all fits together. Mobile is the big one. AI is the new enabling technology. UX is gluing it all together, and it's increasingly an expectation. And it looks pretty different from where we were 10 years ago. I mean, it really is starting to look quite different from showing up and taking more or less a paper and pencil assessment process on a computer. So anyway, thanks for your attention, and I'm happy to answer any questions. And I'll be here for drinks at Solera.
Hey, Ken, I've got a question.
Yeah, lay it on.
Well, you know, as psychologists, we're trained to pay a lot of attention to nonverbal communication. And we're also trained to pay careful attention to how people talk about themselves and other people and about other things. It sounds to me like what you're doing here is trying to move that data collection and interpretation away from clinical judgment and into some kind of empirically based measurement system.
Yep, that's exactly right, Bill. It's the idea that now that the computational models are so sophisticated that they can handle unstructured data like conversational responses. And the approach that we're primarily taking is we're actually trying to see if the machine can replicate expert human judgment. So we're trying to capture and measure the reliability across raters and things like that. So we're trying to capture competency judgments from experts in competencies and evaluating human behavior. And then what we're going to do is see all of the inputs that those humans had in terms of what people said. We're mostly focused on what people said. Maybe later we're going to look at how they said it, the audio and the prosody and breathing and all, pacing and intonation, all that. That's a whole beast. And then the facial stuff is a whole separate beast. So those are inputs that a human does have and absolutely does factor into our judgment. Those are also, though, what we've spent 60 years trying to get out of people's judgment in HR practice is what they look like and what they sound like and their disability status and their race and gender. And so it is kind of interesting. So we're focusing right now on purely the content that people produced in their responses. And then the criterion is expert judgment. So that's taken as kind of the gold standard with known levels of measurement error, because we're actually having multiple raters and things. And then we're using machine learning to digest and all of the words that people said. We can build predictive models that can somehow extract meaning, maybe even at a comparable level to what an expert competency person would get out of that interview response.
It's really interesting to hear you talk about expert judgment as your criteria for the moment, because I know, for instance, the MMPI, the impetus for putting together an empirically derived instrument was the unreliability of clinical judgment. But on the other hand, we've gotten better at judgment tasks. So
yeah, I think it's easy because the case we're starting with right now is structured behavioral interviews. So it's a pretty well proven path in the in-person interview space that kind of more structure, and in particular more structure on the scoring key, leads to more reliable and more valid interviews. Yeah. So, through behavioral anchors and rater training and things like that, I think we have pretty good confidence that we can get to where two people will more or less agree on what they heard in a particular interview response, at least as it matches against the scoring rubric. So if we can we can measure how well we're doing that. So if our inter-rater reliability and agreement is way off, then we're not doing a good job. But we can actually dial that in pretty well to where people are agreeing, almost all the time. And that's the criterion. So it's not quite a clinical score integration of, test scales or a predictive diagnosis or something like that, which obviously those are harder to predict anyway. More or less, did you see these behaviors almost in a checklist in that person's response? And if humans can agree on it, maybe we can get the computer to agree on it too.
Cool, thank you.
I got a question in the chat here as well that I wanted to throw out here so we didn't roll over it, but Marcy Young is wondering, is wondering if you think UX will become the norm so that you'll see a standard deviation in the opposite direction for more traditional computer assessments.
I can't imagine a large business would ever produce a product without a lot of UX input at this stage. But it costs, right? So if you're a small, if you're a small provider trying to build something custom for a client, you either have to cost that in for them, or they get something that looks more traditional. So UX is it's a whole profession, it's a whole team. We have a whole team of people, designers and UX folks, and they're not, we used to think of like graphic designers. These are people who make logos and stuff. That's not what these people do. They actually consider where people are trying to go with a task, with a journey. They talk in terms of journeys and how you get places and visual layouts. It's very much more like ergonomics and human factors. So yeah, I think for anything of significance, it is going to be the norm. And then it will be quite jarring if you get something that has had very little UX invested in it. So yeah, I kind of think so, Marcy.
If I could just jump in, Ken, this has been an awesome presentation. I've always been curious about personality. We were very conservative about jumping on that versus cognitive. Have you looked at an increase in R squared? Does it really make a difference over and above cognitive? And then I guess the bigger question would be, how do you prevent, the inequities we have in society from being locked in with AI?
Yeah, or locked in with cognitive. I mean, I think you're got a bit of a devil in one hand and a devil in the other in that one. So personality and incremental validity. Yeah, I think there's some interesting stories with personality, and there was a piece of research that we got actually the M. Scott Myers Award for about 3 years ago that had started under CEB. It was this long 8,000 validation study that was primarily the OPQ, which is personality instrument. But the conclusion of the study was, yeah, you can get some modest validity on average from personality. It's an omnibus personality measure. It measures kind of, all facets of personality. And yes, there's some predictive information in there that's useful for predicting, in this case, it was leadership success. But it was kind of averaged out. And what we found is you could actually get triple the prediction if you knew a little bit more about the job, and specifically about the context within which these leaders were going to be operating. So it was an interesting study because it didn't look at competencies. So it didn't look at role requirements through the sets of behaviors, competencies lens. It looked at kind of how might two finance leaders with the exact same job, how might those jobs actually be different contextually? So it was kind of trying to measure the E in the whole behavior as a function of personality environment. And what we found is we tripled the prediction if you measure these business challenges, and you can get the R squared from personality up into some, pretty nice ranges, and the R squareds in the teens. So kind of high 0.3s. But it's not just kind of blanket saying these traits are always important for all of these roles, for all of these levels. It's getting away from the kind of broad brushstroke of a big five and getting more into these dialing up the right set of traits to match the kind of demand characteristics of the situation, and actually having a model and a measure to get those demand characteristics to develop these predictive composite scores. So we actually built that out and now have basically a way to triple the predictiveness of personality. In general, personality does add to cognitive. In general, cognitive decreases in utility over time. When I look at talent mobility programs, I am concerned about the use of cognitive, because if these people were too dumb to be a leader at your organization, you would have found that out within the first couple levels of leadership. And I'm not sure how developmentally useful it is to tell people that they're low in cognitive ability. So I'm actually kind of down on cognitive ability, actually, because of the pernicious racial outcomes. And that's not just the US phenomenon. I know this is a Minneapolis-based crowd here, but often I'll have international colleagues say, well, that's a problem in the US. It's not actually. It's a problem in every single society. The lower power group scores lower. Immigrants, children of immigrants, poor people, people under financial pressure. These all have direct effects on people's test scores on intelligence tests. So I actually am moving professionally more towards advocating a pretty limited role for cognitive ability tests. I think they're a bit of a blunt instrument and overused. And I think there's some new things that are coming along that can help make back up some of what we believe we're giving up if we move away from cognitive.
But it's little g, it predicts everything.
It does. It's pretty magical, but it actually predicts, if you look at, so you can't find very many meta-analyses that don't apply a lot of corrections. One of them, though, that was really good is Bobko et al. Bobko's meta-analysis shows that the uncorrected validity for cognitive ability is about 0.35. The uncorrected, so apples to apples, validity for predicting whether you're black or white is 0.38. So it predicts race better than it predicts performance, actually. Which just sucks, right? As it's like, oh great, why did you do this to us? Previous generations of psychologists, and it put us in a really difficult bind. But you know, that's not to make you all feel terrible. We're working on the issue. I think we've got things that we can do. I would say, though, it is time that, you know, we should be encouraging, especially for grad students on the call, questioning the dogma that we've been fed since of 1970s psychology and the kind of averaging meta-analytic view of the world. I think it's a bit overblown, and we're actually leaving some prediction on the table by looking for these kind of one-size-fits-all tools. As we always expected, it depends, you know, and I think the prediction is really going to come from that nuanced understanding and modeling of the situational demands, and that's how we're going to get better prediction, as opposed to just looking for, you know, who are the people who have had, you know, more advantage in our society and therefore show up as kind of mentally healthier. And I don't mean that from a clinical diagnostic. I just mean that from a, what is cognitive ability really measuring? It's kind of measuring how free from worry are you, really.
So Ken, I've got another question.
Lay it on me.
Just no, what you were just talking about. Instead of one size fits all, instead of having trained experts, subject matter experts, to make judgments about how to interpret verbal or nonverbal material, what happens if you use untrained people? Can you distill out of that some universals and then maybe some things that you can also categorize for criterion variables?
Yeah, I think it's, I don't know the answer. So I think it would be a really good piece of research. I suspect that when you use untrained people, I mean, so when we do, if you think about what training you do before you give someone a performance rating task or an interview rating task, it's always centered around common sources of bias and error, you know, halo bias and leniency bias, and it tries to get people to focus on the behaviors. So if you weren't doing all those things, then I suspect you just might be more susceptible to capturing how attractive was this person, how impactful was their first 5 to 10 seconds, you know, like all of those things that might skew the results.
Mm-hmm.
So we do see that things like attractiveness and confidence, these are strong predictors of people's interview ratings.
Mm-hmm.
Sure. So we know that stuff happens.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think I would love to see that study, and hopefully what we're going to be able to do as we get to where we're scaling this stuff using technology is we can actually do some of those studies. Like, let's have naive raters rate them. Maybe they're picking up on more intuitive stuff that our bias training is getting in the way of our better common sense or our intuition.
Well, my guess is what you're looking at is the nuances of building and using relationships to get stuff done. And you know, that's certainly going to have incremental validity. You know,
yeah, I wonder if you can get that in an interview. So I think you're right that if you're right that if you're kind of treating the person as the recipient of the message, like how did that affect you as opposed to how well did that person do?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I like that as an outcome variable, and you see that a lot. There's a company I just saw that it's a startup company that they're trying to measure sentiment in all of your internal communications, and they're trying to say like, people are pissed off this week, you know, you could see it in their emails basically, and the computer can read it in their emails. And it seemed interesting to me, but I was like, man, that seems like a legal nightmare. I don't want to have to sell any of that stuff.
We got a couple other questions here in the chat we might have ran over, but I know one of them was from John.
Oh, regarding mobile, the development you shared with us was impressive, and thank you for that. But regardless of what's trending in terms of who uses the tools the most, is it not best to have a candidate use in a pre-hire assessment similar tech to what they would actually use on the job? And if so, how many jobs rely on phones as primary tech itself? So it's one thing to go with I kind of hate what's trending, as though that's like we should go there because it's trending.
Yeah.
You know, and 20 years ago, people would say, well, do I need to use, I'm afraid to go online. And we'd ask the client, well, is a computer job relevant for this director level position 25 years ago? And it was kind of a 50-50. And now they are. But I just wonder, it's nice to bow to the phone, but isn't there something to be said for using the tech that is then going to be required on the job itself?
I think you're right, John, especially in the area of work samples assessments. So the classic example is a call center simulation. So call center jobs, probably some of you have seen them. They're hard jobs. You know, you're stuck there. You get this kind of never-ending calls, and you're working on a computer, and you're typing and talking, and there's emotional labor, and you know, so they're kind of tricky, and they have high turnover, and so people use tests for them a lot. And the tests that they most prefer to use are call center simulations because they look and feel like the job. And we had exactly that philosophy, John, which was isomorphically, you know, you're going to be doing the call center job on a desktop. You'd never use a small screen to service those. You're going to have to open up all these windows. It's going to, not only are you going to be on a desktop, you're probably going to have 2 monitors and a keyboard and this and that. So we very much designed our work sample based simulation to look like that. It doesn't require multiple monitors, but it's a desktop based, and it doesn't work on the phone. Like you can't even, we made it so that it won't run on a phone. It says, you can't take this on a phone, go somewhere else, go to a desktop. Surprisingly, employers in that space want a mobile sim, or they want a mobile assessment. So, and they're willing to sacrifice the simulation piece of it if they need to, because of the stats I showed at the beginning. And that's just because of where their candidates are coming from. A lot of their candidates for a lot of these call centers are, you know, this is side jobs for students and things like that, or younger people, or, you know, college graduates who are not entering a profession even.
Sure.
And what they're finding, and so the pressure back on us has been, yeah, we believe you. That is a lot more like the job, but we can't get people to get through the process because they don't have computers. And so we're just missing all of these candidates. It can't.
And the employer is providing the tech anyway, as distinct from the work from home deal.
Yeah, exactly.
UIO.
Yeah,
Okay.
exactly. So it's not a kind of
That's
bona fide
fair.
occupational requirement that they have to have a desktop anyway. So yeah,
Appreciate that.
even in that area where there's a really kind of strong, this is the job, they're pressuring us to get
Okay.
you know, other people. So I think you're right, but yeah, I think there's limits to it too, and people are willing to trade off some of that fidelity or correspondence for access to more throughput of candidates.
Thanks. You mentioned the HBO CNN movie Persona. A colleague of mine, Ben Datner, was one of the people interviewed throughout, and I share his sentiment that the movie was a dumpster fire. It was a hot mess, and he was very disappointed because he went in with earnestness to be interviewed about things psychological and was played. So Persona is a hot mess. I don't think a lot of people are gonna. Probably not a lot are going to watch it. It probably won't affect us too badly, but it really sucked.
Yeah, I mean, it's certain. I'm sure everyone's seen PsyOp's response, and we've been doing some blogs. It was definitely a PR kind of fire over on this side too. And I think we should take our lumps. It's obviously extreme and scary music and all that, but I think we should be self-critical, and we should look and see what is it like. How could they be that upset about it? That's what I wanted to know. Like, how can anyone be that passionately against something that to me has always seemed, benign, at worst, if not helpful.
Well, the one piece of empathy I have for that is your comment earlier about the humanistic side of testing. And I've sent you an email separately about what does feedback mean in that initial survey you did, because we take a very humanistic approach where candidates get to see their test data before we submit the report. They get to see a draft of the report. We want to hear from them ideographically.
That's awesome.
Uniquely and specially. And they have the last word. They review our draft report and they get to comment last. So I do have empathy for the piece about, well, where's my voice in an evaluation of me? And that's going to be a piece of the panel. And Anna, who's on the call, is on the call. And we presented on that at SIOP 2 years ago in a debate forum, and kind of prevailed that actually revealing data to candidates was not evil, and in fact satisfied candidate experience, increased validity. As a training firm, my grad students are getting horse's mouth feedback, so a lot of good in that. So I have empathy for that strain, but mixing Myers-Briggs with selection, but
yeah, they twisted it to make their point.
Exactly. Thank you. I need to jump for another meeting, but thank you all. Thank you.
Cool.
I had one more question here. Sorry, Ken, I'm sure you want to get off. From
No,
Randy, that was buried deep in the chat here. And he's wondering what AI ML fitting into, how you see AI ML fitting into traditional psychological research, and whether the psychologist GLM toolkit will be replaced by something more recent.
Yeah, I think if you look at training programs 5 or 10 years from now, they're almost certainly going to have a big piece of that as the analytic toolkit. So I think general linear model can take us pretty far, actually, for most of the things we do. But I think getting into this unstructured data requires some different approaches. Interestingly, even for a lot of the sophisticated ML stuff, it ends up coming back to, after the feature development piece, they end up sticking it into a multiple regression equation or a logistic regression. They end up using regression. Sometimes it's a special form of regression that's made to accommodate hundreds or thousands of predictors and to correct for that, like ridge regression or lasso regression. But ultimately, they're using general linear model when they actually come, in many cases, when they actually come to build the predictive algorithm. And the machine learning bit is really in the development of the predictors that are going to go into that model. So I think it is going to be a hybrid. Good question, Randy.
This is Dick Olson. I have a question.
Sure.
For many years, we spent, especially I think earlier on in the 80s, we spent a lot of time looking at the reliability of our predictors, but we weren't paying much attention to the reliability of our criterion. And we all know that a leader can be very effective in one context or organization and then move to another organization and be an utter failure. I'm curious, and thank you very much. You've had a very interesting and articulate presentation tonight, and we really appreciate that.
Thanks, Dick.
Are you doing anything to look at, and maybe this is up to more the social psychologists, but to look at some of the cultural contexts to try to understand the different criterion that we might need to use in different contexts and organizations?
I'd say yes and no. So I'll kind of tell you some of the things we're doing just so you can, and I suspect many other practitioners and organizations are doing similar things to us. So first, just in terms, so I agree with you, the criterion problem is still there, alive and well. And anytime, and it's enjoying a newfound celebrity because all of this machine learning stuff requires a criterion or you can't do anything. And the entire system that you develop can only ever be as good as the criterion because it's all empirically developed. So unlike where we've got theoretical models where we can kind of exceed the limitations of our criterion because we've done good job analysis and things like that, with machine learning, because it's empirically driven, you need a number as an outcome measure, and that the quality of that number is going to completely limit or cap the quality of your predictive system. So you're very right that the quality of the criterion and the reliability of the criterion is a critical issue in all of this stuff. For some of the leadership research that we're doing, we looked at multi-source as a way to try to improve reliability. So multi-rater feedback, basically 360, top-down ratings, some team subordinate ratings. Rarely did we get peer ratings. And then we used a composite performance criterion to try to capture quote unquote true performance. So when we do leadership research, that's how we're trying to solve for some of the criterion on reliability. In terms of the cultural thing, that's a tricky one. You know, I think the closest we're getting is that research I mentioned earlier, where we looked at actually kind of business challenges. And some of those business challenges correspond to cultural differences. So for example, one of the business challenges that if you know if a leader is dealing with this, yes or no, you can triple the predictiveness of your personality would be, are you leading a global cross-cultural team? People who are leading a homogenous team with the familiar nationality to them can be successful with a different personality profile than somebody who's leading a global cross-cultural team. They're going to require, say, more empathy or whatever those features are. So there's things like that where we're trying to model, like, what is it? It's not just, hey, be a leader at this level and have these competencies and these leadership principles. It's also, what is happening in the business around you and what are some of those unique challenges and how are they manifesting? I think that's the closest we're getting to that cultural nuance that you're talking about, Dick.
Thank you. That's good. I would really like to see more work in looking at the business context and challenges at a global level. It's tricky. I think it's complicated.
I got one quick request for you, Ken, unless there's no other questions. Could I just get a clean close? I don't know how we're going to edit this or where we're going to cut or which questions we're going to include, but nice, clean, and sexy for me with a big smile.
Yeah.
Perfect.
Yeah, thanks everyone. It's great to be here at MPA. Thank you everyone for the engagement during the session. Happy to answer questions offline, connect with me via LinkedIn. Roger and the team have my email and I'm happy to follow up with everyone. So thanks everyone.